We just want people to discuss, what first got you hooked or intrigued in science. I had really good science teachers in middle school, including one in 8th grade, my biology teacher, who was extremely interested and passionate about genetics, and just something about the way that she described the DNA code and how it sort of affects our behavior in general just really hooked me on science for life and created this science addiction that I have to this day.
I grew up in Tasmania, which is part of Australia, just loving animals and being so intrigued by the complexity and wonder of animals and living creatures in nature. And this just grew into my being a molecular biologist, and then more and more being interested in the enormous complexity and the challenges and the excitement of trying to understand life, including humanity.
My freshman chemistry class at Reed College was critical. My professor was this delightful, enthusiastic young woman who was 23 and had a Ph.D. from MIT in the 60s and thought chemistry was the coolest subject on the planet. There were 4 girls in my freshman chemistry class, and we all got doctorates in chemistry. And I'm just going to toss in that my chemistry lab partner was this handsome young mountain climber, and that led to me becoming a major expeditionary mountaineering leader.
For me, my father's a professor of medicinal chemistry and pharmaceutical sciences. So when I was a little girl, I would go to his lab and he would let me feed cancer cells. And he was also doing computer-aided drug discovery. So I could see protein folding structures and things like that on these big silicon graphics machines. He wanted me to go into the chemistry, and I was really fascinated by the computers he was using. So that's how I came to be inspired and intrigued by science and technology.
2 things. First of all, my dad also was a big inspiration for me as a pharmacist. He inspired me to understand that science and medicine were both fun and you could help people, which I thought was terrific. And then in 7th grade, my teacher, Sister Edita Maria Rojo, was a nun from Cuba and a physician. And she showed me that a feisty gal would do really well in medicine.
I got started hiking in the Sierras and just loving nature. And I had an inspirational high school teacher and a high school biology teacher who told me about the NSF Summer Science Training Program. And I think I was in the last cohort before the program was killed. But they sent high school students to college courses over the summer, and we were all doing field work. And after that, I learned that I could sneak into the seminars at UCLA at the biology department. If I understood the title, I figured I could probably make my way through the seminars, and just really became interested in the whole scientific process and moving from just loving nature to thinking about how you ask questions and come up with elegant ways to solve problems. And then at Berkeley, I was also fortunate to get an undergraduate fellowship to go do research in the tropics in Panama, and so sort of slid into being field biology that way.
Yeah, so I'm an arts theater girl, so why am I here? In high school, I had some great teachers in physics, and what they taught this young dramatist was that science is not just rote fact, but it is character. It's full of character with great goals and great, all the elements of a good play are in science, and those eureka moments are incredibly stage-worthy and riveting. And so I absorbed as much as I could in that vein. And so my very first plays, besides writing the ones that writers have to write about themselves and their own, issues, turned quickly to great figures of science. And so I've always been able to find the blend, the stage-worthiness of science there.
Well, I grew up on the Stanford campus with 2 parents who were physician scientists, and almost all of our close family friends were outstanding scientists in one domain or another. And I guess I really had no idea, the sort of quality exposure that I was having at the time. I took it for granted that Arthur Kornberg taught me about football, and I made cookies for Josh Letterberg's faculty meetings. But I grew up in a world where everybody was very committed to science, very excited about science. Science and its applications. And I guess, I thought everybody that wanted to make a difference in the world did science until I entered the broader world. And perhaps more interesting is what made me want to work at the interface of science and society. And that was really training in medicine at the time that the HIV/AIDS epidemic emerged, and seeing how that was where things really needed to happen.
A challenge with not getting answers to sequences of whys all my life, whether it be about the nature of light or space and time, or I remember a poignant moment where I was asking my family what God was made of, and looking for an answer, and wasn't getting a lot of answers from the regular channels. So I ended up pursuing answers in multiple places. I ended up being very deeply focused on mind and brain, which led me to doing a Ph.D. and MD at Stanford with the Ph.D. in artificial intelligence.
Well, my interest in science was really inspired in my 7th grade life sciences class. Up to that point, I think my science education had been very much, here's a textbook, here's a list of facts you need to know, memorize them, and spit them back out for a test at the end of the unit or the year. And my 7th grade teacher really turned that on its head. Instead of going to the front of the class and starting another lecture on, here's exactly what you need to know for the standardized test, she went to the front of the room, and the first thing she taught us was the scientific method. And then she told us, instead of teaching us about, say, environmental issues, she told us to use the scientific method to go out and actually find real issues in our community. And then throughout the year, with that foundation, we actually went through the process of studying an issue with the scientific method, and then ultimately devising and actually implementing an entire solution. So for my class, we went out and restored a wetland that was within 1.5 miles of our school, and being able to see how science wasn't just this body of content, but something that could have a very real impact on the world, was incredibly inspiring, and I was completely hooked at that point.
It was life itself, growing up, just being a little kid, curious about the world around me, and just assuming that I could participate and would be able to contribute, and having science projects from 1st grade all the way through. And I should add that I went to Chicago public schools, and I had wonderful teachers who encouraged me, and whether they had the laboratories or not, they were actually there. Then other things that happened, and I should say that I actually believe my parents, who we would not call scientists in some sense, I think were the best scientists in the world for me, because they asked me to critically think about everything. And my mother, who was a school teacher, always was there sort of saying, look it up, what do you think, how do you work on it? My father, who did construction, helped me to construct things. So it was going through that made a difference. And I should also add that I believe that from the very beginning, to me, science, social sciences, the arts have never been disconnected. I grew up wanting to be a professional dancer, doing arts and studio art classes. And so for me, this whole combination is something that's really important. And the final piece I'll add with my fellow Stanford folks is that I took values, technology, and society classes in college with engineering, as well as majoring in African and African American studies and chemistry. So for me, these things are all very interconnected and part of what our world should be.
Growing up, I was that annoying child that was always, but why? But why? Explain why. So I always wanted to know how things worked and why things came to be that way. So when I got into grade school, science and math classes provided that answer to me, because I could see how things were made up. I could see how calculations were constructed. And it was, for me, my 9th grade math teacher who really made me just love math. And in turn, I loved physics and chemistry because of the math connection. So when I hear everybody talking about all the teachers that inspired them, it makes me so excited, because that's why I became a teacher, because I know that spark, especially in grade school or middle school, can really determine what you're going to be and what you're going to do in life. So I wanted to be that impact for others.
So I grew up in the first 11 years of my life on the Upper West Side, where one of my favorite places was the Museum of Natural History. Then when I was at the end of 5th grade, we moved to Huntington. And one day in the local library, I saw a pamphlet from a place I never heard of called the Cold Spring Harbor Lab. that was in Huntington and had summer courses for junior high school students. So I took courses there, which turned me on to science, and we drove around Long Island looking at geological formation. I thought this is fabulous. And then in 9th grade, the National Science Foundation sponsored a program at Stony Brook on man, society, and technology that first got me interested in those issues, sort of science in the social context. And finally in college, when I was 19, I got a job at the NIH working in a lab for Carlton Gajdusek, who had won the Nobel Prize for discovering what would become prions, and sort of seeing how, again, his work was in Stone Age tribes around the world discovering various diseases, and at that point I was totally hooked.
My father was a physicist, and so he instilled in me a love for science, for astrophysics, for electronics. He would build these radio modules at home and would let me participate in it. My mother was a storyteller, and so from her I got this love for storytelling and wrote as a hobby. At some point down in my career, I mixed the two. And so throughout my career, I've been involved in telling stories about science, and I've found out more and more and more, and to this day, why it's important to really bring the awe and wonder, but also all of the policy aspects of science to society.
Since I was about 5, I've been fascinated with just trying to understand the world, and that's sort of the frame through which I've always used it. Science has helped me sort of build a model of how the world works, and I, unlike other subjects where I would tend to forget things that I learned, I tend not to in the science and technology domain, and so but I never chose to pursue it professionally, and instead I'm a venture capitalist where I help fund scientists and engineers who are using science to make new stuff.
I was a history student and had only some interest in science. I like math very much. But after college, I was given a book called Causal Thinking in the Health Sciences by Mervyn Susser. And Mervyn, who later became my mentor, was one of a small group of white South African physicians who in the 1950s recognized that primary care medicine in a country where there are literally millions of Black Africans with no access to medical care, primary care wasn't a particularly useful focus, and population health was really what he had to focus on. And he and his colleagues sort of invented this sort of modern epidemiology field. And I read this book, I said, this is what I want to do when I grow up. And I was fortunate that I was working at a hospital in the Bronx, and they paid for me to get a Ph.D., and I've continued from there.
I got into science as a child. My dad was in the Air Force, so I moved all over, and when I was 7, we lived in Iceland, and a Navy diver brought a sea urchin into my classroom, and I could not believe that was an animal, and I certainly couldn't believe it was an animal living in the ocean in Iceland. So straight through was into marine biology, which seems like a far cry from science communication, but it turns out it's incredibly helpful to challenge all of your assumptions about how animals communicate with each other, which led me into where I am now.
And when I was a freshman in college at Pomona, a lot of people ran up to Stanford for the Thanksgiving holiday, and I didn't have a place to sleep, and my friend lived in a dorm called Cedro, and the dorm resident was a guy named Bill Dement. And so they had a sleep lab in the basement of the dorm, and I was a sleep subject in the experiment in order to have a place to sleep. And I just found the idea that you could look at a squiggly readout on a sheet of paper and predict when somebody was dreaming was just fantastic to me. So I ultimately went on and did a PhD in sleep research, but I decided that science itself was kind of boring, but learning about science was a lot of fun, and telling stories about it was a lot more fun. And so I got out of science and into journalism.
For me, science has always been about doing science rather than reading about science. I find it kind of ironic in some sense of how sometimes we try to encourage engagement in science, but there's a lot that's out there as information, but the real aha moments that happen is what transform us. So I think the way I think about all my experiences have been those aha moments that happen. They were completely accidental. They sometimes had nothing to do with science. My parents were not scientists, and just stumbling your way into science is even with a series of accidents is how I found it to be a fascinating way to explain my own world.
I'm also going to go back to my 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Jean Clancy. She did 3 things that were just so great. And not only for me, but as I meet classmates later on and the parents, she helped generations of 5th graders pull up their socks and really get on with whatever they were really going to be and do. The first thing is that she took us on nature walks all the time, like every week. So it was kind of like a Darwin walk, I think, those Darwin walks. Just the experience to be there, see this changing of the seasons, really it wasn't really called ecology then, but just really developing an affinity for ecology. The second thing that she would do is put a math puzzle up on the board every morning. And my father, who was a math educator, also helped her with a lot of those. But that math was really fun. And which I think is also part of why I became a scientist. And the third one is that she really insisted on excellence. That she just really wouldn't let any of the kids get away with laziness. So, and she was kind of the first teacher to actually instill that. And that's, I think, also part of being a scientist. There's like that energy towards, that we've got to get it right and be rigorous.